Peace and happy new year, everyone. Happy National Day of Racial Healing. We're in our 6th annual year. Also, to everyone out there, happy post Martin Luther King Jr. Day. We thank God for our dear ancestor. And for folks who don't know, we're in the 6th annual year of the National Day of Racial Healing. It was proposed and advocated for by over 550 of the nation's leaders. And it has 3 primary goals. The first one is to find ways to reinforce and honor our common humanity. The second one is to acknowledge that there are still deep racial divisions in the United States, and also to commit to engaging people from all walks of life, all racial, ethnic, class, sexual orientation, and other demographics, so that we can all understand that we share this thing called humanity. It is my great pleasure to be here as a part of this conversation where we'll hear from our nation's leaders and also some of our nation's leading advocates on major legislation that's before Congress that can get us towards racial equity. First, it is my deep, deep pleasure to introduce Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She represents the 13th Congressional District in California. Go Oakland, go Berkeley. She is a dear, dear friend and also one of my favorite sheroes of all time. She brings us here together, and she's also the pioneer behind the historic legislation to enact the United States' first Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission, which we'll hear about a little bit in this conversation, or a little bit later, actually. Next up, we have Dr. Gail Christopher, my dear colleague, co-founder of the National Movement for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation in the United States, former senior advisor and vice president of the Kellogg Foundation, also one of the originators of our National Day of Racial Healing, and also currently the executive director for the National Centers for Health Equity. Next to her, or above her, depending on where your screen is also my dear colleague, Dr. Ron Daniels. Dr. Ron Daniels is a man of many trades, the former executive director of the National Rainbow Coalition. He also is the founder and president of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century, IBW, which also convenes the National African American Reparations Commission, or the NAARC, and also a major proponent of HR 40, the bill to establish a commission to study and create proposals for reparations for African Americans. And lastly, but not leastly, which we'll see joining us in a bit on the screen, is Representative Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from the 18th district in Texas. Shout out to Houston and all of the Beyonce fans. I always think of that when I think about Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. She is the lead on the HR 40 bill, which I previously mentioned, is to establish a commission to study and develop proposals for reparations for African Americans. Our goal today is very simple, and that is for us to really talk about what does racial justice mean, what does racial healing mean, and how can the legislation that I just mentioned now be something that the Biden-Harris administration can adopt to push forward the racial equity we all need. And for all of those who don't know, my name is Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter. I'm the creator of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, former inaugural chair of African American Studies at UCLA, and an author of several books, including Radical Reparations, which is forthcoming. You've heard enough from me, and I'll just start by pitching it to Congresswoman Barbara Lee. When you hear a National Day of Racial Healing, what comes to your mind? What comes to the surface?
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Hunter, and glad to see Dr. Ron Daniels, my friend from 100 years ago at least, and Dr. Gail Christopher, and my colleague, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Dr. Hunter, let me just say, the way we met was you were on television during an interview talking about these issues that we're talking about today in terms of racial equity, racial justice, healing, racial healing, and reparations. And so out of that interview, I knew I had to get to meet you. I knew I wanted you on our team. And so I just am so delighted that you are part of this, leading this. And it is just remarkable that we have you to help us, to shepherd these policies, the framework, the dialogue through. And so just thanks again. And racial healing for me, I don't start with racial healing. I start with how do we get to racial healing? How do we get there? You just don't heal because you say, I'm sorry, or you just don't heal because you think that this is a new day and forget the past. we have to have this moment of truth telling, this day of reckoning in America as it relates to the historic uh, white supremacy, the historic ramifications and impact of enslaved Africans being brought to America, and what took place 402 years ago to this day, and how it's manifested today. And and I'm going to share a story with you because after the murder, and I come from a wonderful progressive district, the 13th Congressional District of California, Wakanda, okay, Dr. Hunter, and Oakland and Berkeley. And so many of my constituents, though, called me. They could not understand why Mr. Floyd was killed and what took place with regard to police brutality and police murders. Then some called and told me, I see all these Black people dying from COVID. What is this about? Now, these are enlightened people. And I'm saying, wait a minute, don't you know the trajectory from 401 years ago to today? You are seeing systemic racism right in front of your eyes. This is what we talk about when we talk about systemic racism. And we have to break those chains, and it's directly related to the enslavement of Africans. And so what racial healing means to me is, first, we have to bring the country together in a truth-telling moment and understand, because the public has got to understand what has taken place in this country, how it impacts young people, how it impacts Black families, how it impacts Black men and women, how it impacts every institution that we have to live with in America. And so the purpose of racial healing is, once we bring people together, because Lord knows this is a political struggle, we have to make the case for reparations, which we understand. That's transformation. We have to transform this society and repair the damage. Okay. And repairing the damage means we have to dismantle those systems and those structures that have led to the health disparities in our country, to the wealth gap, to the unemployment rates, to the disproportionate rates of injustice on every single front. And so racial healing, yes, fine, but we have to have that day of reckoning. We have to have people come forward. We have to have the descendants of those who were enslaved. We have to have the generational picture painted where people understand in this country why, in fact, we have to get to reparations. And finally, I'll just say, when people, talk about healing, sometimes I feel kind of like, don't talk to me about racial healing right now. Let's talk about the truth first. Do you know? Let me explain to you. Let me tell you what happened with my grandmother. My great-grandmother was born in Galveston, Texas, enslaved. Okay, my great-grandmother. My grandfather was born in Galveston, Texas, 10 years after in 1875. Okay, this is not so long ago. I mean, I lived with my grandfather. My family, was enslaved, and so I know what the ramifications are on me today, or my grandchildren, to my children and grandchildren. So people have to understand those connections, and before we can even talk about healing. And so that's kind of where I start on this. And so that's why this discussion is so important. This is the first time we participated in this around HR 19 and HR 40, because it's important to understand how we have to move forward together. And so I just want to thank you again. I see my colleague, Congresswoman Jackson Lee here, and how we begin to crack these chains that have been with us for 402 years now in America. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee, and welcome, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. It was so lovely to have you. As we hear about reparations, I want to pass it to you, Dr. Ron, and hear some of your thoughts connected to what Congresswoman Lee just offered, and thinking about the full picture of the harm and trauma that we are with today, that we actually are in a place where we congressionally and legislatively have the opportunity to do something about it.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Marcus, and it is really a privilege to be with Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and of course Dr. Christopher, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Of course, she didn't have to tell how old we was. I mean, she didn't have to tell it, but
we've known each other at least 100 years now. That ain't telling how old we are.
Right. So let me just say that I think the Congresswoman has painted a very, very, very clear picture. Let me just refresh our memory in the way that Martin Luther King did. Because that's why narrative and truth telling is so important. Because every year we have white supremacists, white nationalists, and reactionary people who just want to act like what happened in the past didn't happen. And so Martin Luther King, his "I Have a Dream" speech, everybody talks about the dream part because he will take us to the mountaintop. That's what our preachers do. They don't leave us in the valley, they take us to the mountaintop. And so, he talks about this whole notion of one day, we will have a time when our sons and daughters will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And so you hear that being played over and over and over again, because that is the aspiration. What he also said on that day, however, was to remind America that we have a bounce check. He talked about a promissory note, which is supposedly enshrined or guaranteed by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to guarantee the rights of liberty and justice for all. He said, but every time we present this check, it comes back marked insufficient funds. And so really the purpose, the narrative has to let people know why there's insufficient funds. Why does it keep coming back marked insufficient funds? And so when we look at the broad sweep of history, just from the perspective of Martin Luther King, he talked about, the ways in which Black people were excluded, not only the issue of enslavement, but excluded from the Homestead Act, excluded from the GI Bill, excluded from so many things that others benefited from. And I'm naive enough to believe that, if people knew better, they would do better. That's why narrative is important. Now, I mean, not everybody might not know better, but we don't necessarily have to have everybody to know better. But we have to tell the story. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, I remember a conversation that she talked to us about in pushing forward HR 40. She said, we have to let people have to see it. They have to feel it. And even when we as people of African descent sometimes don't want to feel it because we have experienced it. My father took me to a tree in Georgia where one of our relatives was lynched. I looked the other day, just happened to get a glimpse of Mothers in the Movement and saw the story of Emmett Till, and it just like pierced. I mean, it was so painful to relive that. And yet we have to relive it as in the whole concept of Sankofa and, the whole concept of to go forward is to go backward and to come forward again. But America must go through that experience. They must go through that experience because, while people are trying to dodge critical race theory, which is really a legal piece not taught in public schools at all. But the basis for critical race theory is to do what? Exactly what S19 is talking about. To tell the story, because it's never been told. I'm a professor. I'm a retired now distinguished lecturer. I go into my classrooms, and when I tell them that America was decided to be a white man's land, they get. I say no, but I will, like Malcolm said, I will give you documented evidence from 1719 on. Time after time after time, it's written that they wanted this to be not a white man and woman's land, a white man's land. So when you get somebody like Mitch McConnell get up and say, oh, the filibuster, the founding fathers never meant, well, the founding fathers never meant for women and people of color and Native Americans to even be involved in this. And so that's our mission. That's why this is so incredibly important. This is a moment of national reckoning. And it's painful. But indeed, this country will never, ever achieve a more perfect union unless we go through this moment. And so there's a complementariness to S19 and S40, both of which have components about study. But at the end of the day, the study is not just for a feel-good exercise. It is about the question of achieving healing and reconciliation through a process of redress, of remedy, of being able to repair the unconscionable and unimaginable schemes that have gone on. Just quickly, the lynching, the communities that were destroyed, Black Wall Street and Greenwood. Over and over and over, there are people who have no clue about these things. And so we know that in this period, with the dedicated leadership, Dr. Christopher and Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, that we are going to achieve this. We ain't gonna let nobody turn us around. We ain't going back, as John Lewis said. We're going forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ron. And I want to come to you, Dr. Christopher. In many ways, for folks who don't know, Dr. Christopher did decades of research on the practice and process of truth and reconciliation in 40 plus nations that have done that work in order to generate a way for America to learn the lessons of that, and also then pushing forward this National Day of Racial Healing. I'd love to hear from you, Gail, about your thoughts on this day, on what we've heard so far.
Well, thank you, Doctor. And I just want to say what an honor it is to be here with my colleagues, with our nation's leaders. And I concur with everything that's been said. I would only say that the effort toward truth, racial healing, and transformation is really a very pragmatic one. We live in a democracy, and as we're seeing with all this frozen action in Congress, we need the majority of the people to stand up for racial justice. And so when we talk about racial healing and we talk about bringing diverse people together, the pragmatic strategy here is that we must have a majority of people who get it, who are willing to stand up. And I agree wholeheartedly that we have to tell the truth. And that's why the framework begins with narrative change. We have to tell the full story. Now, most of what we know is that story. I put it in the realm of unspeakable almost, because the horrors and the continued denial of the humanity of people of color and people of African descent in particular. Most people have no clue of the nature of those atrocities that lasted not during a war, not during a brief time, but for centuries. They went, and no one said, well, some people did say this was wrong, but the majority of the country did not. And so when we talk about racial healing, we really put it at the center of the truth, racial healing, and transformation framework, with the pragmatic goal of expanding the circles of engagement so that we have enough of the political power, if you will, to make sure that what we put in place to redress the reparations, the policies, the equity measures, the justice policies, that they are put in place and they will be sustained and not reversed. So often, if you live as long as we have, you know that so much of what we do just gets reversed. And I would just say that it gets reversed because this underlying premise, this permission to devalue the lives of people of color, that premise has never really been thoroughly debunked. I don't use a term that suggests that there's anything superior about white, that there's anything superior about any race. But we know that this undergirding belief system that somehow we have this taxonomy of humanity, and some people are at the top, and the way it was designed back in the 1700s, Black people were at the bottom. Well, that basic taxonomy of devaluing humanity, it still drives this country. It comprises the basic ethos of this country. And the ethos is, the spirit of a thing. And so the spirit of America is still grounded in this fallacy that we are not created equal. So when we talk about racial healing, we're talking about eliminating that fundamental fallacy so that we can come together and stand up together and sustain the positions of redress and reparations and transformation that are necessary, quite honestly, if this democracy is going to work. But I just am honored that we're having this discussion, and so humbled by the Congresswoman, both Congresswoman Lee and Professor Daniels, all your life's commitment to this work. And so, yes, let us move forward and figure out how to build the critical mass that we need so that we succeed and we don't lose our right to vote, for example.
Thank you so much, Gail. And I turn it to the inimitable Congresswoman out of the great state of Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who's been really leading the charge after the great ancestor John Conyers to have reparations happen. I love to hear from you, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, on your thoughts of what racial healing means and how this pairs with your historic effort to enact reparations and get that study bill forward.
Dr. Hunter, it's certainly my privilege to be able to be here with you and two stellar and outstanding leaders of womanhood, and of course, the anchor and iconic Dr. Ron Daniels. Delighted to be here with Congresswoman Barbara Lee and really want to heap accolades on her for her unselfish commitment to have us work together both as sisters, but also as those who struggle together for the absolute imperative pathway for America to heal. As we go forward in Con Res 19 and HR 40, they are two directions that do not deviate from the crisis of, how should I say, the crisis of morality, the crisis of understanding, the crisis of reality of where we are as people of color, but in this instance, the descendants of enslaved Africans. John Conyers, of course, moved by his own advocates and constituents and his own sense of justice, introduced this legislation in 1989. And so it has its own decades of fighting and struggling. HR 40, the Commission to Study Slavery and Develop Reparation Proposals, immediately after the passage of the American Civil Liberties Act, which rightly so gave reparations to the interned Japanese. Now, how difficult would it have been to take the legislation modeled after the American Civil Liberties Act in 1989? And typically you could say that it's reasonable not to pass legislation in its first year of introduction, but why not the second year or the third year or even the fifth year? And it was not. And so the question is very much the topic that we have this evening, which is clearly to acknowledge racial healing for justice, reparations, and transformation. We need that now. And we who are fighting for HR 40 have utilized the terminology of which Congresswoman Lee, my friend, my sister, has drawn to why we can't wait. But I think what I'd like to do in the moments that I have to comment is how potent and powerful this session is today. Because as we speak on the floor of the House, on the floor of the United States Senate, senators are tussling with a simple process. And that is simply continue the legacy of the dreamer. Simply do what you have acted on, I'm sure, in your political life. I could venture to say that all 100 senators at some point in their life went to a Martin Luther King celebration to show their constituents, to do what politicians do, to just show up, to make sure they check the box. I would say to you that almost to 100, they had gone to that celebration. Did they understand what it meant? Did they even know Dr. King? Did any of his words relevant to them at all? Did they know anything about the foot soldiers, people who died unnamed? Al Sharpton's just written a book that included Jimmy Lee Jackson. I know him well in his death and the cause of his death. But how many Americans would know him or know the young sister pregnant who sat down on a bus before my beloved Rosa Parks? And many others, unnamed, unknown, in the movement, the second Civil War and Reconstruction, I called it. And so here we are. Let me get, as it ties into reparations, because reparations is restoration and repair, but it is a law that would say and demand that the nation turn its attention to what slavery did to those who were descendants of enslaved Africans. And I had a paragraph that I wanted to just bring to your attention, and I will do that in a moment. But it is to raise the question about whether we can, at this point in our history, document this question of what slavery did to Negroes, or what slavery did to colored people, or what slavery did to African Americans, or what slavery did to Black people. And as we look at where we are with a simple question to America, can you just vote on Voting Rights Act? They're tied to Black people, to African Americans, to descendants of enslaved Africans, even though the 15th Amendment is the right to vote tied to the freeing of slaves. It is an amendment that says you have a constitutional right to vote. Mm-hmm. So I would make the argument in court that it applied to white people, Hispanics, and Asians, and others. But yet here we are. The disparities are clear. It seems that it is tied to us, and we can't get past a fickle, simple, insignificant rule called the filibuster to go forward to help us in voting. I believe that squarely puts you in why HR 40 and the issue of reparations is so definitively needed, and why Dr. Daniels referred to Dr. King's speech on a blank check, insufficient funds. That every time you come to an issue dealing with those of us who are the descendants of enslaved Africans, there is a red stop sign. And so we must get people in America to understand. And I had a wonderful conversation on the floor today as I give you a summary of this answer. A member from Michigan, Oakland County, Dr. Dan, you'll take joy in this, a white district, a white member who used words that I had given in messages or sending messages out or talking on the floor to her to be able to answer a question of someone in her district. But she came to me and said, Oakland County in Michigan is ready for HR 40. That is what this is about. It is about being bold enough to tell people what they need to know, and to be bold enough to tell the truth, as Dr. King did, and that we are still the descendants of enslaved Africans and impacted by slavery, if not in our minds, in the minds of those who see us. And so every time an issue ties to us, there is an obstacle, there is a stop sign. America cannot restore itself of the original sin if it does not treat the issues of those who are descendants of enslaved Africans like everyone else. And we need this commission to be able to purge these negative attitudes so that we can be equal and our issues have the respect and dignity of that of being an American, and that they are addressed because we have in fact passed these two legislative initiatives.
Thank you so very much, Congresswoman Jackson Lee. And I'm going to kind of summarize, and now I'm going to come to you, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, thinking about the Biden-Harris administration and the racial equity push and a lot of the things that we have going on. But I really hear overall that part of what folks really need to appreciate is that slavery is one of the major premises of America. And what's important about understanding it as a premise is that if it is a premise, then there is no such thing of the place without that premise being in place. So when people are asking to attend to the premise, that's actually foundational, that's fundamental. And I often hear in different spaces, whether it be the truth, racial healing, transformation space, or if it's the reparations space, where we hear from folks whose descendants come after the Civil War, let's just make it clean that way, who say, I had no involvement. My family had no involvement. And what I say in response is that America, the United States of America, was notorious in its reputation for slavery. Everyone from here to the other end of the world knew America as a slave-holding, slave-loving country. So if people come afterwards and they're like, well, we had nothing to do with native land dispossession, we had nothing to do with slavery, but you definitely came to a place that had a reputation for it. And importantly, lastly but not leastly, you know, I spend most of my time in a vocation as a teacher. And importantly, the word reparations, the root is the word repair. But importantly, the word repair individuates it. It's about individual action. The word reparations moves the I to TIONS. It's about the government, holding the government accountable for what it constitutionalized, what it sanctioned, what it legalized. When we're talking about racism and a hierarchy of human value, it's about a government that sanctioned it as its premise. So I want to come to Congresswoman Barbara Lee and ask her, for all of those who are listening and watching and thinking about what Congress has before it, whether it be the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the George Floyd policing bill, reparations, truth, racial healing, and transformation, if Biden-Harris administration is listening to us, and I like to think they are, what is something that they can be doing or thinking about and pushing forward what I think is a historic move in their administration, which was issuing racial equity as a key pillar of success for their time in office?
Sure, and thank you for that, Dr. Hunter. And let me just say one thing before I comment on the Biden administration. I think the point you made about slavery was a legalized system in this country. When people ask me or say, look, I wasn't responsible, my family wasn't, you know, I have to back them off and say, look, we're talking about legalized policies and laws that many of which are manifested today in the same way. And so this is a legal system that we're trying to dismantle through what HR 40 will do. The Biden-Harris administration, I'm pleased, delighted, and I think it's historic that they made racial equity a pillar in their agenda. They issued landmark executive orders calling for centering racial equity and justice within all of their policies, and look at ways that the federal government can marshal resources to support efforts to, in many ways, repair the damage. But what they haven't done, I don't think, is get to the core issues with regard to the systemic reasons for this, rather than tinker around the edges. And I say that because I understand the political context in which we all are dealing with. But I think we have to make sure that they go deep into equity issues, because when you look, for example, and I'm gonna give you an example, the infrastructure bill that we passed. Well, we still haven't passed Build Back Better, where the job training and workforce training, primarily for African Americans, formerly incarcerated individuals, people of color, that's where those funding and policies are. When you look at infrastructure, the racial equity piece has not been as prominent as any of the other components of the infrastructure bill. And so it's got to be embedded into everything that this administration does. And again, what they are doing is historic, but I think they need to remember the 402 years ago as they promote and develop policies that address racial equity so that they can repair the damage, so that they can dismantle what is in place. And I talk about CDC, for instance. I have legislation that would set up institutional racism as a public health issue. Myself, Senator Warren, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Okay, but my question to them is, what systems are we going to dismantle if we're going to say there's racism, institutional racism is endemic in the public health system? So you can't just build upon something that needs rebuilding. And so you have to dismantle certain systems. And I think that's what we have to make sure happens, that we just don't pile on top of unfair, unjust policies by saying we have racial equity. Finally, I'll just say, in terms of, and I have to just share this because I'm very proud of my state. And I talked to Congresswoman Jackson Lee how California, I believe, is the first state to establish a commission to study and develop reparations. And I remember going way back to 1989 when Congressman Conyers first introduced HR 40, that the California Democratic Party, I went to the Democratic Party then and got the California Democratic Party to support HR 40 in the day. And so I'm so proud that California finally has put up this really wonderful commission that really is looking at what to do in terms of the truth-telling moment, as well as repairing the damage and coming up with proposals as we speak to provide for reparations for African Americans. And so I think that the Biden-Harris administration can look at some of California's commission, can look at some of the local commissions that Dr. Christopher, that yourself, that Dr. Daniels have been working with throughout the decades, and really begin to look at strategic strategies that could be embedded in and formulated in an overall Biden-Harris agenda, racial equity agenda.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee. I'm going to go to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee and ask that same question. You mentioned being in session and speaking with someone in Michigan, and I'm thinking, on this issue of racial equity, what say you to the Biden-Harris administration, or how we can really get that ball moving forward?
Well, I also want to be able to answer, and thank you so very much. And I need to mind my manners appropriately to make sure that I acknowledged Dr. Christopher, which I did not get a chance, but I enjoyed her remarks. Just want to make sure that I said, I'm so delighted to be with her. I hope I did, to thank her so very much. But let me also start by indicating a twist of the answer of I came after, I was not involved. The question is a benefit loss analysis and or the question of benefit. And so if you got here yesterday, you benefited from 246 years of slavery, of unpaid labor. I always like to say,
Yes.
no unemployment insurance, no workman's comp, no health insurance, no life insurance. You had people who were born a slave, lived a slave, and died a slave, and then their next generation did the very same thing. They made cotton king. The transatlantic slave trade gave money to Europe and to the United States. Cotton built the Wall Street banks. The Wall Street banks were the capitalistic infrastructure of America that generated into manufacturing, that generated into the commodities market. And so the very fact that we, this little small fledgling 13 colonies, succeeded to overcome and override the age-old Europe, Asia, those areas had been, in quotes, developed with cultures before this so-called baby America. But we shot up economically with a dip down in the Depression in 1928, 29 into the 1930s, but came back after the war and became a powerhouse. And when I say the war, World War II, and became a powerhouse, and little homes were spread all across America. And if you came after the 1800s, or you were the Irish or the Italians that came in the early 1900s, you benefited. You developed wealth and you benefited. And then alongside of you were, I gave all the names that we've ever been called, except for the N-word, but colored and African-American, Negroes, Black people, and otherwise the descendants of enslaved Africans. So I think that answer should be pointedly responded to, that your very essence is because you had 246 years of those whose backs were bent to grow and pick cotton, the single commodity that we had. I wrote a piece that said it is impossible to determine directly how the lives touched by slavery could have flourished in the absence of bondage. I think the commission will be able to do that. But the one thing we know today is that those who want to ask the question about them coming after, they can look to political engagement, education, healthcare, wealth, and criminal justice, and find stark inequities in the descendants of enslaved Africans today. So I think with respect to the Biden-Harris administration, it will be H-Con-Res 19, it will be HR 40 for them to embrace, because the very fact that we are suffering and having obstacles as it relates to the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which if you look back on it now, is simply a non-controversial legislation. Why do I know that? Because I have police officers who will come up to me and understand that bill and indicate that that is not them. And it is not a good portion of police officers across America, maybe 80%. But it does have a dastardly impact on young African American males and others. And why have we not been able to get that, voting rights, HR 40, and of course, as we support H. Conres 19. So to the administration, I would say, go boldly. Dr. King's words in terms of not having your life be in vain, or as he said to Negroes, that you can't accomplish anything with your backs bent. It is best to stand up. And it is always a credit to an elected official, to the President of the United States, Senator, that when their constituents see their backs standing up, I can assure you the applause comes. You will hear people who disagree with them say, I disagree with you, but I respect what you have just done. There were many people who disagreed with Dr. King. His life was lost for that reason. But why is he still alive today in terms of everyone trying to honor him, at least around his holiday? Is because they view him as someone who meant what he said and said what he meant, and gave words that are even inspirational today. I want to finish on this point about who we are. And that is that it is a sense of knowing your history. Just very quickly, Senator Manchin's state left Virginia to not support slavery. This is the state he lives in. Senator Manchin's state was the founding place of the Niagara movement. Senator Manchin's state elected the first Black woman to the state legislature in 1928. I will continue to have that imprinted in my soul and my DNA. What then leaves him with no basis on standing on that history as opposed to any other history? You can find courage, and people will respect you for that. And I think the administration, there are two outstanding leaders, President Biden and Kamala Harris, and I believe that they can stand on courage and also the work they've already done to pass these bills and sign them.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. And I'm going to come to you next, Dr. Christopher. And before I do that, we've heard a little bit from both Representative Jackson Lee and also Representative Barbara Lee about what's also happening locally on the ground. And for those who are watching, I always like to give out resources. And as a part of our Truth, Racial Healing, Transformation collaboration, co-conspiratorship with HR 40 and all of this other legislation, we've worked with Bridging Divides over at Princeton University to actually map and provide a map of all of the local efforts that are out there for truth, racial healing, transformation, and also reparations. You can go to their website, bridgingdivides.princeton.edu, and find that map so you can educate yourself. And what's super cool about it is that it also tells you which representatives are supporting the legislation that we're discussing. So you also get a way to hold your elected officials accountable for the things that we know on the ground that we need. I come to Dr. Gail Christopher to hear your words on the Biden-Harris administration, racial equity on this day of racial healing.
Thank you, Dr. Hunter. I concur with what's been said. You know, this is an unprecedented moment in history. It is a moment of racial reckoning. And part of the legacy of this administration, I think, should be to take this moment very seriously beyond the calls for equity, as has been so eloquently stated, to going deep enough to understand that the resistance to that, the fact that our nation is dividing and becoming so polarized, that underneath all of that is the issue, the unresolved issue of racism in this country, which is a direct outgrowth of the, I guess you could say, the development phase of this country, the 240 plus years, actually 400 years in totality, or 402, in which we still allow this belief system to create our country, to create our ethos. And so I think that embracing these two efforts, the truth, the changing the narrative of our country, the building the capacity to to have the psychological strength to face this truth. This truth is hard to face because it is really quite ugly, but it is also an amazing truth in terms of the resilience that of our people and the resilience and the progress that we've made as a country. And then to address the systemic ways in which racism is institutionalized in all of our systems. These are governance systems. They're at the city, the state, and the national level. So I would say to this administration, let's really have the courage to put in place the infrastructure, the framework for moving our country forward and go beyond reckoning to actually repairing, healing, and sustaining, if you will, transforming a new system that is grounded in respect and the value of all people and the courage to own up to the past. We would be a beacon for the world if America did this, just as the whole world knew America was built on enslaving African persons. The whole world would be awed if America finally would address that in an honest and forthright way in terms of telling the truth and repairing and compensating and acknowledging. I mean, this is just integrity. This is a moral imperative for our country. And so I really encourage this administration to take that to heart and let that be the legacy. I would also suggest that our democracy depends on our capacity to do this. The Justice Department is acknowledging and created a special unit acknowledging that white supremacy groups, if you will, or white nationalist groups, in this homegrown nationalism and hatred is the biggest threat to our national security. And if we're gonna really take that threat seriously, it has to be because we create a culture that just simply doesn't allow that to be, because we have developed the capacity to stand up for one another as human beings. I could go on, but I would say to this administration, this is the moment. A dear colleague and friend, Dr. David Williams, I asked him this question on a panel recently about this moment, and he said, "We just can't fumble the ball." Now, I'm not good at any sports metaphors, but I heard it. We're at this moment where we can't fumble the ball. We have to make progress that would be sustainable over time, not just for us, but for future generations. So I would really concur with what my colleagues have said. These two pieces of legislation, the HR 19 and HR 40, they should be a package that this administration stands behind and a gift that this administration gives to this country.
Thank you so much, Gail. And I'm going to come to you, Dr. Daniels. Same question. And as you've heard me say before, Black people, people of color, people who have been repressed and oppressed in this country, not only do they deserve a comprehensive expression of racial equity, but they have earned it. They have earned it. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Dr. Daniels, on this question.
Well, so much has been said. Let me just first and foremost amplify a couple of points. Number one, I just have to quickly just re-embrace the contribution of Congresswoman Barbara Lee in terms of the legal framework, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee talking about what is in reality the intergenerational deficits and benefits of enslavement. Those things that we were excluded from, which allowed other people who took the benefit from to pass that on intergenerationally and build wealth. I mean, this is something that when you talk about truth telling, we could just spend the whole commission, the HRS 19 commission could spend a heck of a lot of time just on the triangular trade, just on the whole issue of Walter Rodney talking about how Europe underdeveloped Africa, how Barclays Bank and Lloyd's of London and these huge corporations, and in fact, the textile industry, the whiskey distilling industry, these were built on the backs of African labor, the brutal extraction of labor. And one of the things and so when people say, well, I didn't benefit, well, it's not about an individual indictment. There were industries, whole industries that were created that allowed you to get a job when Africans were denied same. And I would, when we had the hearing a couple of years ago on Juneteenth, Trina Brown was one of the people who came to testify, and her family was involved in it. And she's written this documentary called Traces of a Trade to just show you how it works. And so I would ask people to look at this concept. And let me just say, it's not just in the past. I'm from Youngstown, Ohio, steel town. My father was a steel worker. I remember 1956, the Hungarian revolt broke out, and there's a huge Slavic population in Youngstown. And, you know, and people came from Hungary, and they came to the United States of America, and they came to Youngstown. And it was interesting because we know in those days, just in the 50s, there was a ceiling above which Black people could not rise in many of these industries, including the steel industry. And so what we found was people who came from abroad, they came in and immediately were able to get the higher grades. Just theoretically, 1, 2, 3, that's what Black people couldn't go above 3. 5, 6, and 7, those are the better jobs. White people could take those jobs, and they did. Now, I know there's somebody out there, well, I don't know what happened, but those families were able to pass on that gap between the wealth and wages of the bottom tiers and the top tier to their families intergenerationally. That fundamentally has to be understood and can be told. Second thing I want to say is equity. People should also understand that equity is equitable, it is magnanimous, and it is to be commended. But equity deals with what we do now, henceforth, and forevermore to make sure that in the future certain things don't happen, that we apply a lens that ensures that these inequities do not continue in terms of contemporary public policy. It does not address the accumulated harms and damages of the past. Reparations addresses that question. So I just want to have clarity about that concept. And by the way, when you have the Congress of the United States looking at these issues and wanting to understand it, maybe all they ought to do is go to the Scripps Howard most recent revelations that indicate that thousands of members of the Congress of the United States over decades were slave owners. I mean, that would be a great forum to have them look and examine to the degree to which the complicity, the engagement of members of Congress who owned slaves, some a few, some not just down south, up south. Second point I wanted to make. The other thing I want to make is this whole point I want to make quickly on the question of voting rights. To me, we should make voting rights one of the high demands in terms of reparations. There should never, ever be a question of the voting rights bill ever being debated again. Voting rights ought to be permanent, now, henceforth, and forevermore. Not only should it be permanent, in reality, if we really want to get down to how this repair can be made, there ought to be a certain number of representatives guaranteed seats in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. I mean, that's what they did in South Africa. They reversed the formula. The oppressors in South Africa got special recognition. They ensured that their interests would be protected because they got extra disproportionate representation in the parliament of South Africa. And just finally, let me just say quickly that we are also proud that California, has set this precedent. Dr. Shirley Rubber is a friend I've known for many, many years, and she was emulated and put forth the HR 40, and it was taken up by the legislative caucus and signed into law. But we're also proud of Evanston, Illinois, where Evanston, Illinois is not just studying it through the courageous leadership of Robin Lou Simmons and people like Ham Howard of the National Coalition for Blacks for Reparations in America and COBRA Legacy Organization and many others. It has been put in place. It is actually concretizing, letting people know that reparations is possible because it is being done. Reparations are being awarded. And what that means is that it's building a structure, an edifice, which can begin to receive federal reparations. In fact, it builds the case for federal reparations because the amount of reparations that can be dispensed in California or in Evanston are not sufficient. But all across this country, from Asheville to Providence, Rhode Island, to Chicago, to New Orleans, we just convened a major symposium bringing many of these groups together. Reparations is alive and well and pushing for this national reckoning. And I am so honored and proud that all of us who are in this conversation are pushing us to this moment in terms of making sure that America indeed will, in fact, do what it needs to do in terms of creating a more perfect union.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ron. And the good people who are behind the scenes for us have told me we rolled down to the end. And before I pass it, and I'll give it, it's going to come to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Dr. Ron Daniels, Dr. Christopher, and we'll close out with I'm going to call you Dr. Congresswoman Barbara Lee at the end. But just to summarize what we've been hearing today, part of, for folks who are listening, what we're trying to talk about and what we've all been up to is really trying to counterbalance. We hear systemic inequality, we hear systemic racism. We know those to exist. And what we're all working on and what is before our Congress is an opportunity to build out systemic equity, systemic shared humanity, systemic inclusivity. But there is actually a system that enforces what we otherwise say are ideals, that becomes the new premise that we're all living in and working towards. Before I go to the closing statements from everyone, and I'm told we each have 2 minutes, I just want to offer what is my favorite quote from Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King. And it comes before he was known in the center of the world. And just after Brown v. Board, 3 years later, it's a speech called Look into the Future. And he writes the following: the future is filled with vast and marvelous possibilities. This is a great time to be alive. Let us not despair. Let us realize that as we struggle for justice and freedom, we do so with cosmic companionship. I think of you all as our cosmic companions, especially for folks who are on the ground voting every day, like my mom and my family. Look into what you all are doing to make sure that we're moving in the right direction. It has been an honor and pleasure to be here with you all. I pass it over to you, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of the great state of Texas, for 2 minutes of closing remarks.
Well, first of all, again, it's a pleasure to be with you, Barbara, if I might, my sister, and Dr. Christopher, Dr. Hunter, Dr. Daniels, and Barbara and I are doctors by osmosis, I'm sure, by being on this wonderful presentation with you. I could, as you can see, go on, but let me indicate that we have no option. There is no option to not pass these two initiatives. There is no option not to cure the cancerous, sinful act of slavery that covered the breadth and depth of this nation. There is no option to not try to cure the deeply embedded racism that Dr. King spoke about when he was in a Birmingham jail, and he spoke to the jailers who took credit and comfort that they were white versus Dr. King, who was jailed as they were trying to tell him he was wrong-headed in his protests, as Dr. King asked him about their compensation, their salaries, and found out, of course, that they remained at the bottom. America can gain by promoting and encouraging and passing legislation that makes us all equal. Dr. Daniels is right. We should not be sunsetting voting rights, police reform, reparations. It should be where these laws are in place, and it will be the guiding force of a new and changed America. It will show a courageous administration standing on the courage of history and the courage of our ancestors. And I just want to just immerse ourselves in Dr. King. I want to again refer to more specifically the quote that he made in the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech. And just to say that he was talking about in 1962, the Negroes in Albany, Georgia. And he said specifically that these Negroes decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't or woman can't ride your back unless it is bent. We've got to straighten our backs up. We've got to make sure that no one is on our backs and that we're going somewhere. And he concluded his remarks, which is so important to getting something done. Why are you hesitant to get rid of the filibuster? Why are you not voting for voting rights? Why are you not voting for cloture? I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It is in this metaphor, or these actual words, whatever your beliefs may be, that we cannot fear anything, that we're doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing for America. We're cleansing and clearing and repairing and restoring. We must pass this legislation. I, for one, will not have a bent back, because I'm going somewhere, that this legislation has to become law. HR 40, Conres 19. And in finality, I'm not worried about anything, as Dr. King has said, in honoring his legacy and his dream. I'm not fearing any man or woman. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. It is our time. We must proceed and be victorious. Thank you all for this wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and for your service to this great country. Dr. Ron Daniels, eyes on you.
Well, quickly, let me just say that it's been an honor to be with this great panel. And to quote a friend that many of us know, Kwame Trhd, a.k.a. Stokely Carmichael, he used to always greet people by saying, ready for the revolution. Well, we need to be ready for the revolution. And that revolution is a revolution really that Dr. Martin Luther King talked about in 1967. We talked about a revolution of values. And I won't go back and talk about it all, but King was radical in terms of what he was putting forth, including the whole concept of an economic bill of rights to make sure that the edifice that he talked about that produces beggars needs restructuring. He was talking about a systemic change in this country. And that's what we're doing as we move forward with HR 40. We need to be ready for the revolution. What that means is we need to study. We need to study. We need to educate ourselves. And we need to organize. And we need to be prepared to march on ballot boxes like never before in order to ensure that the vision that we have will prevail. It is ironic, but it is ironic justice that the rejected stones are on the verge of becoming those people, who are going to rescue democracy. So be ready for the revolution. A part of that education is knowing your resources in terms of HRS Con 19 as well as the HR 40. You can go to the IBW website as it relates to all things reparations, IBW21.org. That's IBW21.org, and you will find the most extensive online reparations resource center in the world. Educate yourself. And once you have educated yourself, or as you are educating yourself, be prepared to move forward with the revolution that is going to change this nation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniels. As the great sociologist Stevie Wonder said, do yourself a favor, educate your mind. I pass it to my dear colleague, Dr. Gail Christopher. Your 2 minutes, eyes on you.
Thank you. I would just say what an honor it has been to be with all of you this evening. My thoughts focus on the we. When we say we must pass the legislation, we must move forward. Getting to the we is why we created this National Day of Racial Healing, so that we can do the on-the-ground work to expand those circles of engagement so that we is large enough in a democracy to drive our agenda forward, and most importantly, to sustain it. So this work of building connective tissue within communities so that we have a greater capacity to stand up for justice, this is the work of truth, racial healing, and transformation. 400 years cannot be reversed in a moment. We have to institutionalize the commitment and build the sustained systems for the narrative change, for the education, for the compassion and the empathy and the understanding and the unity that we need as a country. And then we have to deliberately address the legacies of how we maintained racial hierarchy in this country through separation, through our legal system, and through our economy. So we have 5 pillars of approaching TRHD. We think of it as holistic and comprehensive. And right there, we are ardently in support of reparations because we know that there must be repair of the tremendous harm that has been sustained over all of these centuries. So we've got to do this work. The work is happening. We've got to honor the communities that have had the courage to do the work. And we collectively have to make sure that we are a broad enough coalition to sustain the changes that have to be put in place. And I would echo what my colleagues have said. The future of our democracy really depends on us doing this, doing it now and doing it well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christopher, and shout out to you for your vision, and also to all of our Native and Indigenous brothers and sisters who have joined our movement, Japanese Americans who have been writing in favor for reparations, so people understand this is a multiracial, international-based set of ideas and agenda. Lastly, but not leastly, my gratitude to Congresswoman Barbara Lee and her staff for bringing us here tonight on what for me begins the 50th anniversary of Shirley Chisholm running for president. I think it is only right that we hear from Congresswoman Barbara Lee to close us out. Thank you, everybody, for this wonderful evening.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hunter, for keeping us going and really crystallizing what the issues are and where do we go from here. And to Dr. Daniels, Dr. Christopher, and my colleague and sister, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Let me just say how important this panel, this dialogue was tonight, tomorrow, and in the future. And thank you all so much for giving us the time to be able to talk really to and with the public who are with us tonight. And thanks to Kayla on my staff and to Congresswoman Jackson Lee's staff, Dr. Daniel's staff, Dr. Christian's staff for helping to pull this together, because they have done a phenomenal job. And so just a couple of things I want to probably reiterate. One is the saving our democracy dictates and demands that truth, racial healing, transformation, reparations be enacted, that this be part of the strategy that will help save, quite frankly, the soul of America. We see right now, and the public understands, white supremacy has surfaced very clearly. We see Donald Trump talking about Black people and people of color are getting health care, white people aren't. This is classic. And so this country right now is on the brink. We know what happened in the 30s. We know what happens with the rise of dictators and fascism, and we know where this country is right now. And so HR 19, HRS 40, we have no option but to get these passed. We have to have this. We can't tinker around the edges anymore in America and go back and repeat some of the same strategies that we've used in the past. So we do, as Congresswoman Jackson Lee has said over and over again, we have to be bold, and we have to really put ourselves out there to make sure that the public, the administration, elected officials know that we're not tired. We ain't no way tired. We've come too far from where we started from. Nobody told us the road would be easy. We came this far. No, he's not going to leave me, you know. And so we just have to keep going and persist, because we will get this done. And I'll close by just saying, and I mentioned this earlier to my staff, this is a political struggle. And so we have to know who's with us and who's against us. We have to be engaged in voter registration, voter organizing. Right now, we have to, and I hope all of you are calling your members of Congress, telling them, be a co-sponsor of HR 40, be a co-sponsor of HR 19, call the White House, talk to them why this is so important. So we just can't talk about this. We have to engage in political action, and elections are coming up. Elected officials work for the people. So therefore, we have to hold elected officials accountable. The people must hold them accountable. So I'm not going to say, I'm not going to let anyone off of the hook. We have to make sure that our political organizing from here forward is central to getting HR 19 and HR 40 passed quickly, because we can't wait. And Congresswoman Jackson Lee knows we have these discussions in the House about when is the right time? When is the right time? Oh, we have elections. Well, the time has passed. We have to do this now. Our democracy demands it. Our people demand it. We have to finally crack these chains of slavery. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, everybody, for watching out there. Always remember that each of us needs all of us. I really appreciate this wonderful conversation and all of the work that everyone's doing here.
Thank you.